I'm Dakota Lane, 29, a tactical operations nurse in the United States Air Force. When I got the call from the Pentagon about the White House ceremony, I stared at my phone in disbelief. For a full minute, I thought someone was playing a cruel joke. My hands trembled. My chest tightened. For years, I had lived with the sting of being the family disappointment. The Lane legacy was built on intellect, not grit. We came from a long line of degrees, publications, and symposiums. My parents, Dr. Caroline Lane and Dr. Peter Lane, had each made their names in the halls of academia, neuroscience and behavioral economics, respectively. My brother Jonathan was the pride of the lineage, a Yale graduate who now advised Fortune 100 companies on global strategy. At every dinner party, he was the name dropped into conversation. He was the golden child. I was tolerated. I grew up in a pristine, ivy-covered home in the hills of Seattle, where dinner talk revolved around Nobel lectures and journal citations. I was enrolled in STEM camps at 10, placed in advanced biology by 12, and tutoring in AP chemistry by 14. My parents framed the trajectory of my life with clinical precision. Pre-med at Stanford, then medical school, and a residency at some top-tier research hospital. But something else tugged at me. Something deeper than test scores or lab reports. It was my Uncle Owen. He had served as a trauma medic in Vietnam. While my parents only ever mentioned his lost years in hushed tones, I was drawn to the war stories he told me when we were alone. They were brutal, yes, but filled with impossible courage. I remember the way his hands trembled slightly when he held up a photo of a young man he'd tried to save. "It's not the medicine that makes you a healer," he'd say. "It's what you're willing to do when there's no safety net." That stayed with me. By high school, I was athletic. Fast in cross-country, strong in swimming, and composed under pressure. My grades were solid B+, sometimes brushing into A territory. Not stellar enough for the Ivies, but good enough for state programs. I knew that was a problem in my family. When I got my SAT scores, I remember sitting in silence as my mother looked them over. Her lips were tight. "Your brother had a perfect 1600, she said. "He got into every school he applied to." I applied to 7 schools. I was rejected from 4, waitlisted at 2, and accepted at 1 mid-level university in Arizona. When I told my parents, they didn't even try to hide their disappointment. "We'll make it work," my father said after a long pause. "You can start there, and maybe transfer to something more fitting. Later." The conversation haunted me for weeks, until the day I passed a booth in the student center. It was an Air Force recruiter, a woman. Her uniform was sharp, her posture commanding. She didn't talk about war or glory. She talked about purpose, about helping people when no one else could, about going into chaos and pulling someone back to life. That night, I stayed up rereading every brochure she gave me. The next week, I signed the paperwork. I didn't tell my parents right away. I waited until I was home for a weekend. The look on their faces when I said I'd enlisted burned itself into my memory. My mother dropped the spoon she was holding. My father stared, blank. "And Jonathan?" He actually laughed. "That's cute," he said. "You're going to play soldier now?" No, I wasn't playing. I was becoming someone they'd never be able to understand. I left for basic training 2 weeks later. My mother didn't say goodbye. My father offered a stiff handshake. Jonathan wasn't even home. The first few weeks were brutal. Nothing about my academic background had prepared me for what it meant to be broken down and rebuilt. We were woken before sunrise, screamed at, pushed beyond our limits. My muscles ached in places I didn't know existed. But as the days passed, I found something I had never felt before. Clarity. No one there cared about SAT scores or family trees. They didn't ask what university I went to or if I'd published a paper. They cared about grit. About who could stay calm when everything was falling apart. About who would step up when it counted. And I did. I ranked top 10 in my training company. My instructors noticed my steadiness under pressure, my instinct for triage, my ability to block out chaos and lock in on a task. "You got medic hands," one of them said. "Steady, fast, and a heart that won't quit. That matters more than a resume." By the time I graduated from advanced individual training as a tactical operations nurse, I had my first stripes on my sleeve and a confidence I'd never known. So when Christmas came, I went home in uniform, hoping, naively, that something had changed. It hadn't. I walked through the door with pride, uniform pressed, ribbons gleaming, and a gift for my mother. She blinked at me like I was a neighbor dropping by uninvited. "Oh, you're early," she said. My father looked up from his laptop and said, "You can hang your coat in the mudroom." Jonathan arrived later with his fiancée, Olivia. When she saw me, she smiled politely and said, "Wow, you look amazing in uniform." Before I could respond, Jonathan smirked and added, "Yeah, it's adorable. So how's the aspirin passing going?" "I'm a field nurse," I corrected him, my jaw tight. "I've been training with medevac units." He raised an eyebrow. "So basically a paramedic with camo?" I didn't answer. At dinner, they talked about Olivia's upcoming law internship and Jonathan's position at a strategy firm in DC. No one asked about my training, my deployment orders. The lives I'd already helped stabilize during simulations that mimicked combat conditions so real, some trainees dropped out from the psychological toll. When I mentioned I'd be assigned to an overseas task force soon, my mother set down her fork. "Overseas?" she asked sharply. "That seems unnecessary. You've done your part, haven't you?" "I'm a medic, Mom. This is what I signed up for." "There are ways to help people that don't involve putting yourself in harm's way," she snapped. "You didn't say that to Uncle Owen?" I replied. Her face froze. "That was different." "No," I said quietly. "You just respect him more." I left early the next morning, my duffel slung over my shoulder. They barely noticed I was gone. My orders took me to a joint base in Djibouti, part of a coalition effort assisting civilians caught in local conflicts. I was embedded with a rapid response air medevac team. Our job was to respond to calls from the field: burns, trauma, gunshot wounds, dehydration, blast injuries. I saw things no classroom ever prepared me for: children with shrapnel in their legs, soldiers sobbing as I tried to save their buddies, civilians caught in the crossfire of conflicts they didn't choose. One night, a local school collapsed during a bombing. I helped dig out a girl no older than 10. Her legs crushed beneath a support beam. I stabilized her long enough for the surgeons back at base to save both limbs. She lived. When I called home that week, my mother answered. "Hey, Mom," I said. "Just wanted you to know I'm okay. We had a rough mission." "Oh," she replied distractedly. "Did you see Jonathan's interview on CNN? He was brilliant. They called him a rising star." I hung up a few minutes later, the static in my ears louder than the distance between us. Back at base, I sat with Staff Sergeant Mendez on the bunk beds, silent. "They'll never get it," she said, "but you don't do it for them." "I used to think I needed their respect," I whispered. "Now I just want them to stop pretending I'm invisible." She handed me a protein bar and bumped her shoulder into mine. "Out here, we see you. That's all that matters." I nodded. It wasn't enough, but it would have to do. If my first deployment cracked something open in me, the weeks that followed broke it wide. We were stationed near the Horn of Africa, where the lines between peacekeeping and survival blurred every single day. Our unit ran emergency medevac missions not only for Allied soldiers, but for aid workers and civilians caught in brutal cross-border skirmishes. The heat was merciless, the terrain unforgiving, the things we saw, unforgettable. One morning, our team was dispatched to a refugee convoy that had been ambushed by insurgents. When we arrived, the scene looked like a nightmare smeared in dust and diesel smoke. Burned-out vehicles, bodies lying in the open, children wailing, screams piercing the air like broken glass. A young Army lieutenant had been shot in the abdomen. The moment I reached him, I saw the panic in his eyes. He was pale, shaking, lips blue. I clamped down hard on his wound, started fluids, called for an evac chopper, and whispered words I didn't believe but needed him to hear. "You're gonna be all right. Stay with me, okay?" The helicopter touched down 20 minutes later. He made it. 2 days later, I got a handwritten note delivered through a base courier. "You saved me. I'll never forget you. Lieutenant K. Anders." I kept that letter folded in my breast pocket for months. Our team worked grueling shifts, 16, sometimes 18 hours, running back and forth between villages, outposts, and field hospitals. We triaged under open skies. We operated under tents lit by lanterns and adrenaline. I became fast with tourniquets, surgical tubing, and field sutures. We had no backup, no sterile labs, no second chances. And I thrived. The other medics in our unit started asking me for advice. Combat veterans started trusting me with their worst wounds. I wasn't just the nurse, I was their medic. I had purpose written in every fiber of my being, but none of that mattered when it came to my family. I called home once a week. It became a ritual I both dreaded and longed for. The first time I told my mother I had been part of an emergency extraction under fire, she gasped, then said, "Well, your brother just received an award from the Global Strategy Council. He's presenting in Berlin next month." When I mentioned the lieutenant I saved, my father replied, "That's admirable, but I do wish you'd consider coming back to finish your degree. You've proven your point." My point? That I belonged? That I could save lives in ways no textbook ever taught? I stopped telling them about the hard parts, the smell of burned flesh, the blank stares of dying men, the exhaustion so deep it turned your bones hollow. I stopped giving them access to my truth, because they didn't want it. Instead, they clung to the version of me that made them more comfortable. The girl who'd made a reckless decision and would eventually come home, tail between her legs, ready to be realigned. But I wasn't coming home to apologize. I was coming home more alive than I had ever been. After 6 months in the field, I was nominated for a Joint Service Commendation Medal by my commanding officer. The citation cited bravery under duress, decisive medical intervention under fire, and outstanding leadership in trauma response. I remember holding that medal in my hand and thinking, not of glory, but of the 10-year-old girl I used to be. Listening to Uncle Owen talk about bleeding in the mud to keep one more soldier breathing. He would have understood this moment, I thought. He would have seen me. When I called home to share the news, my mother was lukewarm. "That's nice, dear," she said. "Have you seen the engagement photos your brother posted? They're in Paris. Quite stunning." I put the medal in a box, closed it, slid it under my bunk. That night, Staff Sergeant Mendez and I sat under the stars behind the barracks, eating MREs in silence. "Do you think they'll ever get it?" I asked. She took a long sip from her canteen, then shook her head slowly. "No, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." I stared out across the camp, at the soldiers limping past, the helicopters on standby, the dust rising into a red-tinted sky. It was real, and it was mine. 6 months into my deployment, I received orders that felt different. Confidential, selective. No details, just a time, a place, and a name. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs. When I arrived at the forward operations tent, there were only 5 of us. All medics, all highly rated. Briggs stood at the front, flanked by 2 intelligence officers. His voice was even and cold. "You've been selected for an emergency assignment with Special Operations Command. The mission is classified. You will not discuss it outside this tent. If you accept, you deploy tonight." No questions. I signed my name. That evening, I was issued new gear, new comms, and flown to an undisclosed base in the mountains near the Sahel border. There, I met the rest of the team, 12 operatives, silent and sharp-eyed, moving like shadows. I was the only medic, the only woman. No one questioned my place. That alone told me I was exactly where I needed to be. The briefing came fast. 3 American aid workers, 2 women, 1 man, had been taken hostage by a militia group aligned with international terrorists. Intelligence suggested they would be moved in 48 hours, executed soon after. Our task was simple: insertion, extraction, and survival. I'd be stationed with the secondary unit in a Black Hawk helicopter, waiting just beyond the mountains. Once the team secured the hostages, I'd move in to stabilize them for evac. I reviewed the medkits twice, then again. Trauma gauze, IVs, ketamine, tourniquets, chest seals, enough to save lives for just long enough to get out. We launched after midnight. The flight was silent, the moon a thin blade in a pitch-black sky. My hands moved through gear checks like muscle memory, but my heart was pounding. 20 minutes out, I heard the first explosion, a scream from the pilot, "We're hit!" I barely had time to grab the overhead bar before the helicopter spiraled. The world became noise, shouting, rattling metal, fire alarms, smoke. I remember someone screaming, "Brace!" before everything slammed sideways. When I came to, I was crumpled under a folded seat, blood on my uniform, my leg, searing pain, not broken, but hit. The cockpit was crushed. Major Keller, the pilot, was slumped forward, blood streaming down his face. I forced the door open and crawled in, heart racing. He was breathing, barely. I stabilized his neck, applied a field dressing, and whispered his name again and again until his eyes fluttered open. Lieutenant Green, the co-pilot, had a compound fracture in his forearm. I worked through the pain in my own leg, splinting his arm, administering morphine, and helping them to cover behind a boulder while gunfire cracked around us. Our second helicopter hovered above but couldn't land under fire. "We're on our own," shouted Captain Merritt, the team leader over comms. The next 4 hours were a blur of adrenaline and horror. We were 12, they were 30, maybe more. I watched Staff Sergeant Ellis take a round to the side, crawled to him under fire, stuffing gauze into his wound with one hand and returning fire with the other. When Private Ruiz was hit in the neck, I performed a field cricothyrotomy with my penlight clenched between my teeth. I was bleeding from my thigh, but I didn't feel it. All I felt was time slipping away. By dawn, we had 6 wounded and no air support. Captain Merritt made the call. "Split. Evac group east to the ridge. Diversion team stays. Lane, your lead on evac." My mouth went dry, but I nodded. We built makeshift stretchers from tarp and tent poles. I distributed morphine, carried vitals, and kept everyone conscious as we navigated miles of rough terrain with no radio signal. We reached the extraction point 48 hours later. As the chopper lifted, I finally looked down at my own leg. Shrapnel embedded deep, the skin blackened and torn. Still, I refused the stretcher. I stayed with my patients. 3 of them would have died without immediate care. 15 lives saved. 1 medic's hands. Mine. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that the scrambled coordinates I had radioed during the firefight had pinpointed the enemy's movement. That intelligence would later lead to a full-scale rescue operation, freeing not just the 3 hostages, but 24 more civilians being moved through the region. I was debriefed in silence, then flown to Germany for surgery. The medal came quietly, a Purple Heart, and a letter stamped confidential. My name, commendation, and field actions were sealed away in a folder I would never be allowed to show. When I called my parents from the military hospital, limping and stitched up, my father asked, "So, is this the end of your army experiment?" I didn't answer. He didn't wait. My mother said, "Maybe this is a sign to finally come home." I hung up. And for the first time in my life, I understood. I had no home to return to. Only the uniform on my back, and the brothers and sisters who never questioned if I belonged. 3 weeks after the operation, I returned stateside for rehabilitation. The shrapnel in my leg had torn through muscle but missed any major artery. The pain was manageable. The limp, temporary. But the damage inside me? That was different. I jumped at sudden sounds, slept with the lights on, woke in cold sweats, heart pounding, from dreams where I couldn't reach the wounded in time. My therapist at Landstuhl called it survivor's guilt with combat trauma overlay. I called it Tuesday. And still, I told no one. The mission was classified. I wasn't allowed to discuss it. Not with the therapist, not with my fellow medics, not even with the mirror. All I could say was that something had happened, something big, and I hadn't walked away untouched. After a month of physical therapy, I was granted 30 days of leave. I could have gone anywhere. A cabin in the Rockies, a beach in San Diego, but something pulled me back to Seattle. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was a foolish need for recognition. Or maybe I just wanted to see if anything had changed. I arrived unannounced. My parents' house was exactly the same. The perfectly manicured lawn, the ivy-covered stone columns, the framed degrees lining the front hallway. It smelled like cedarwood and old money and distant affection. Jonathan and his fiancée Olivia were visiting too. My mother had planned an engagement dinner in their honor, apparently forgetting that I was due back that week. When she opened the door and saw me, uniform crisp, ribbons aligned, the Purple Heart shining near my heart, she blinked. "Oh, Dakota," she said, her smile faltering. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow. We're just setting up for Jonathan's party. I nodded. I'll keep out of the way. At dinner, I was an afterthought. My father toasted Jonathan's promotion. My mother gushed about Olivia's career in corporate law. I picked at my plate, waiting, hoping for someone to ask. Anything. No one did. When Olivia noticed my medal and asked, "What's that one for?" my mother chuckled and said, "Oh, she had a little training accident overseas. You know how generous the military can be with awards?" I stared at her. "It wasn't training," I said quietly. "I was wounded in action, during a mission that saved 15 lives." There was silence. Brief, sharp. Jonathan laughed nervously. 15 lives? What were you doing performing open heart surgery in the desert? Something cracked inside me. "No," I said, louder now. "I was dragging bodies out of a downed helicopter while bleeding from my leg. I performed surgery with a penlight. I stopped a man from dying by shoving a needle into his chest while gunfire snapped inches from my head. I watched another man die in my arms, even though I did everything right. Everything." My mother set down her wine glass. "Dakota, you know what hurts?" I said, breath shaky. "Not the bullet. Not the nightmares. What hurts is that none of you ever asked. Not once. You've never wanted to know who I am outside the version you wrote for me." My father adjusted his cufflink, clearly uncomfortable. "Dakota, we've always said we respect your choices, even if they were unconventional." "No, you don't," I snapped. "You respect success as you define it. Titles, degrees, offices with corner views. I could be dying in a ditch somewhere, and you'd still say I should have gone to grad school." "You're being dramatic," Jonathan muttered. I stood up. I was awarded a Purple Heart, a Joint Service Commendation, and a Classified Valor Citation for actions that saved lives and prevented a mass hostage execution. The president knows what I did. My command knows. Every soldier I pulled out of that valley knows. And still, I came here thinking maybe, just maybe, you'd care too. No one spoke. "I see," I whispered. "I finally get it." I left the table, got in my rental car, parked at a cheap hotel downtown, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. That night, I received a message from Staff Sergeant Mendez. "Hey, just checking in. You okay?" I texted her back one word. "No." She called immediately. "I'm flying out. Give me the address." I didn't argue. The next morning, she showed up at my door with takeout, energy drinks, and that look she always gave me when I pretended to be fine. We sat on the hotel bed. I told her everything. "I thought the medal would change something," I said finally. "It did," she replied. "It reminded the world of what you are, even if your family's too blind to see it." I closed my eyes and let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, my real family wasn't the one I'd grown up with, but the ones who would sit with me in silence and still see my worth. 3 months after that hotel breakdown, I had found my rhythm again, at least on the outside. I'd been reassigned to an Air Force medical unit in San Antonio, helping develop recovery protocols for trauma survivors. The work was meaningful, the pace intense, and most of all, it kept me focused on others instead of myself. I didn't talk about the classified mission anymore. I didn't talk about my family. I just worked. Until one Wednesday morning, everything shifted. My phone rang at Sucks City, an unfamiliar number. I let it ring to voicemail. Then it rang again. This time I picked up. "Is this Sergeant Dakota Lane?" "Yes." "This is Captain Emily Rhodes, United States Air Force liaison to the Pentagon. Please be advised this line is secure. I'm calling to inform you that your presence is requested at the Department of the Air Force office in D.C. tomorrow at 0900 hours. Dress uniform required." I blinked. "What is this about?" "I've been instructed to say only this, Sergeant. It's in regard to Operation Valley Shield. You'll receive full briefings in person. Transportation has been arranged." She hung up before I could ask anything else. Operation Valley Shield. I hadn't heard those words since my field debrief in Germany. That night, I packed my uniform, polished my boots, and stared at the Purple Heart still resting in its velvet box. Something was happening. and I had no idea if it was good or bad. At the Pentagon, I was escorted through 3 levels of security before being led into a small, carpeted office. Inside were 2 people, a brigadier general with a kind face and a civilian man in a charcoal suit with sharp eyes. "Sergeant Lane," the general said, standing. "I'm General Marcus Hale. This is Mr. Carlton, White House Military Office." "White House?" I swallowed hard. "Please, have a seat," Mr. Carlton said. I sat. They slid a folder across the table. Inside was a single document, Distinguished Flying Cross. My heart skipped. "Sergeant Lane," the general continued, "the full details of Operation Valley Shield have now been declassified in part. Your conduct during that mission was reviewed not only by Central Command, but by national security leadership." Mr. Carlton leaned forward. "The intel you transmitted while wounded led directly to the rescue of 27 civilian hostages and dismantling of a cross-border weapons network. Your medical actions under fire saved 15 lives in the field." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The general smiled. "You will be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross by the President of the United States. The ceremony will be held in the East Room of the White House next Thursday at 1400 hours. I stared at them. "This is real?" "Yes, Sergeant," Mr. Carlton replied. "Your actions didn't just save lives, they changed the trajectory of a region. The President wants the country to know that." I blinked, trying to absorb the moment. "And my name?" "Will be public," General Hale confirmed. "With your permission. There will be press coverage. We'll protect certain operational specifics, but your name and your story, it's yours now." Mine, finally. When I left the Pentagon, I sat in my car for nearly an hour before I made the decision. I typed a message to my family. "I'm being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross by the President next Thursday. Ceremony at the White House. You're welcome to attend." My mother responded 8 hours later. "We'll try. Your father has a faculty meeting that day." "No, we're proud. No, we'll be there. We'll try." I set the phone down and stared out at the Washington skyline. I had once believed that a medal, or a podium, or a stage might be enough to make them see me. But now? Now I wasn't doing it for them. If they showed up, fine. If they didn't, I'd still walk across that stage in a room full of people who understood. And this time, I wouldn't be alone. Because the uniform I wore wasn't just cloth and thread. It was everything I had built from nothing. And the world was finally about to know who I really was. The day of the ceremony arrived clear and warm, spring sunlight bouncing off the marble pillars of the White House as if the world itself had decided to shine for once. I stood in the East Room in full dress uniform, my ribbons and badges perfectly aligned, my boots polished to a mirror sheen. The Distinguished Flying Cross pin lay waiting on a velvet cushion. My heart thudded, not from nerves, but from clarity. Rows of gold-framed chairs filled the room. Military brass, elected officials. A few civilians. Across the aisle, I spotted them. My father adjusting his watch, my mother scanning the room with her polite social smile, and Jonathan, arms folded, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. They were seated near the back. Not a word from them since the text exchange. Not even a simple, "We're proud of you." It didn't matter now. The ceremony began with precision. The national anthem, the introductions, the citations. The first recipient was a Marine Corps pilot who had rescued a downed crew in a storm. The second, a Navy corpsman who shielded his team from an ambush. And then, "Sergeant Dakota Lane," the military aide announced. I stepped forward, spine straight, the metal display catching the light across my chest. The citation was read aloud. "Sergeant Dakota Lane distinguished herself by acts of extraordinary heroism while serving as lead medic with Joint Task Force Ember during Operation Valley Shield. After her transport aircraft was shot down behind enemy lines and despite being wounded, Sergeant Lane provided critical medical intervention under direct fire, saving the lives of 15 U.S. and Allied personnel. Intelligence gathered through her field transmissions directly contributed to the rescue of 27 civilian hostages and disrupted multiple high-level threats to U.S. national security." The room was silent. I heard my father shift in his chair. My mother's breath caught. Then the President of the United States stood up. He approached me with calm authority and a solemn gaze that held more weight than any words. "The citation doesn't capture everything," he said to the room, then turned to me. Sergeant Lane didn't just act with courage. She acted with unwavering precision, leadership, and care in a situation where most people would have shut down completely. In a remote valley, under impossible odds, she held her team together. Because of her, people are alive today. He lifted the medal and placed it around my neck. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear in my ear. "One of the hostages you helped save was my cousin. My family owes you everything." I blinked back tears, swallowed hard, nodded once. As he stepped back, the audience rose in applause. All of them. Even my family, though slowly, uncertainly. I turned, saluted, and took my place among the honorees. During the reception that followed, the world around me shifted. High-ranking officers approached to shake my hand. Diplomats nodded with deference. Medical commanders asked about my protocols. Former hostages introduced themselves, some with tears in their eyes. "You saved me," one woman said, clutching my hand. "We were told we wouldn't survive the next transfer. Then your intel came. I have a daughter. You gave her mother back." And then I saw them, my family, standing awkwardly near the wall. No drinks, no small talk, just silent watching. It was my father who approached first, slowly, cautiously. "Dakota," he said. "That was quite something." I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He looked like he wanted to say more, but the words caught. His hand twitched at his side. My mother joined us next, her voice small. "They never told us that it was all that serious." "They did," I said. "You just didn't listen." Jonathan cleared his throat. "So, it was all real? All of it?" I turned toward him. "Yes, every bullet, every scream, every life I held in my hands. It happened while you were giving TED Talks and buying new cufflinks." Before he could reply, a voice behind me cut in. "Lane's the best combat medic I've ever seen." I turned. It was Captain Merritt, now Major, my former team lead. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "She dragged 3 wounded men across a kill zone with shrapnel in her own leg. And she kept going." He nodded once to my family. "Respect is earned in blood and grit. Your daughter earned more than most people see in 10 lifetimes." My father looked stunned. My mother finally began to cry. I stepped away, joined a group of soldiers near the back who had served with me in Djibouti. The ones who knew the cost, who never needed explanation. Staff Sergeant Mendez handed me a glass of soda and smirked. "They look like someone just slapped them with a truth bomb." "They did," I said, "and he wore 4 stars." Across the room, my family still stared, seeing me, really seeing me, not as the failure, not as the disappointment, but as the woman who had stood in fire and saved lives, not despite who I was, but because of it. 6 months after the ceremony, I settled into my new role as a senior instructor at the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine in San Antonio. My job now was to train the next generation of tactical medics, those who would be sent into danger, not to fight, but to heal. In the classroom, I was no longer Sergeant Lane the disappointment. I was ma'am. I was instructor. I was someone they listened to. I built new trauma protocols based on what I had learned the hard way. On the floor of a smoke-filled helicopter, under fire in a ravine with blood soaking through my sleeves. I taught my students how to operate in chaos, how to stay calm when every heartbeat might be the last one they stabilize. And I told them the truth. Not the polished version. Not the part that made it into speeches and award citations. I told them what it was like to be afraid, to fail, to carry guilt, to save someone's life one day and lose someone the next. Because that's what makes you ready. Not perfection, but purpose. One afternoon, after a particularly intense simulation, a young airman lingered behind. She was barely 20, hair pulled tight, trembling hands still stained with fake blood from the drill. "Sergeant Lane," she said softly. "I joined after I saw the White House ceremony. You made me believe this job meant something." I looked at her, really looked. She reminded me of myself at that age, trying to prove something to a world that never quite understood. "You're going to be great," I told her. "Not because of a medal, but because you showed up. You stayed when it got hard. That's how you save people." She smiled through tears, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something deep and steady in my chest. Peace. The changes with my family came slowly and awkwardly. 3 weeks after the ceremony, my father showed up at my office. He wasn't wearing a suit, which felt like a miracle on its own. Just khakis and a windbreaker, looking smaller than I remembered. "I want to see what you do," he said. He sat in the back of my lecture hall, silent, taking notes during my trauma rotation lecture. At the end, one of my students approached me and said, "Ma'am, your dad looked proud." He didn't say anything, but he looked proud. That night, over dinner at a nearby diner, my father finally spoke. "I spent my life thinking achievement meant recognition, publishing, promotion, applause. I never realized some achievements are made in silence, in blood and dust, where no one's watching." He paused, looking down at his coffee. "I judged you by my map, but you were charting your own, and I was too afraid to follow it." We didn't hug. That wasn't us. But when we stood, he gripped my shoulder. It said enough. My mother's change came in pieces. She called more often, sent care packages for my students. One day, a box arrived with something wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was my Uncle Owen's old medic armband and a faded black and white photo of him in uniform. A note was tucked inside. He would have been proud. I should have been too. "I'm sorry." It didn't erase the pain, but it softened it. Jonathan took the longest. One evening, he called unexpectedly. "I've been volunteering," he said, "with a legal nonprofit that helps veterans appeal disability claims." I didn't know how broken the system was. I didn't say much, just let him talk. He told me about a double amputee who couldn't get his prosthetic approved for months. How that man cried when Jonathan finally got it pushed through. "I never understood before," he said. "What you saw, what you carried." For once, he didn't make it about him. During Thanksgiving, I returned home for the first time in years. The house was still the same, but different in small, noticeable ways. In the living room, next to my father's academic awards and Jonathan's law degrees, stood a glass display case. Inside were my medals, my commendations, and a folded American flag. My mother had arranged them. "I didn't know how to frame them properly," she said quietly. "But I wanted them here. You belong here." That night, over dessert, my father pulled out an old recruitment brochure from a drawer in his study. The corners were frayed, the pages annotated with pen. "I almost enlisted," he said. "After college. I wanted to be a military physician. Your grandfather convinced me to take the academic route. He said war ruins men. And I listened." He looked at me for a long time. "You had the courage to do what I didn't. I was hard on you because I didn't understand how much strength it took to be different." We sat in silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. For the first time, we were speaking the same language. Some wounds don't close all the way. There are still days I wake up gasping. Still moments when a siren or loud bang sends my heart racing. Still names I remember that never made it home. But there's also meaning. There's the trainee who saved a pilot's life in Syria last month using one of my airway protocols. There's the student who wrote me a letter saying, "You taught me to see my scars as part of my strength." There's the moment in front of the White House when the President of the United States looked me in the eye and said, "You saved more lives than anyone will ever truly know." And there's me, Dakota Lane, once called worthless by the people I loved the most, now a decorated combat medic, a teacher, a sister, a survivor. And I finally understand. I never needed their recognition to be valuable. I was never worthless. They just couldn't see what I carried. But I did, and that's enough.